The envelope felt wrong in Greta's hands, too thick, too heavy for what it should contain. She had worked for 3 weeks in the American camp kitchen, peeling potatoes until her fingers went numb, washing dishes in water so hot it turned her skin red. She knew what prisoner wages should feel like, had heard stories from the last war when her grandfather was captured by the French. A few coins, perhaps, enough for cigarettes or soap if you saved for months. But this envelope bulged with bills, and when she finally opened it, her mind simply refused to process the number written on the payslip. It had to be a mistake. It had to be a trick. It was more money than she had earned in 6 months working in the munitions factory back home. Around her in the barracks, other women were opening their own envelopes with the same confusion spreading across their faces like ripples on water. Margaret, who worked in the camp laundry, counted her bills 3 times. Ursula, assigned to the vegetable gardens, held her payslip up to the light as if checking for forgery. They had been taught what to expect from their enemies. They had been taught that capture meant slavery, starvation, humiliation. They had not been taught what to do when their captors paid them wages that matched what American civilian workers earned. It was late summer 1945 when they first arrived at Camp Ruston in Louisiana, though most of them wouldn't learn the camp's name for weeks. The train journey from the port had been a fever dream of impossible sights, cities still standing, shops with full windows, people dressed in clothes without patches or visible mending. Through the gaps in the cattle car's wooden slats, they glimpsed an America that shouldn't exist. Their newspapers had promised that American cities were burning, that the population was starving, that society was collapsing under the weight of the war. But here were children playing in yards, women hanging laundry on lines, men reading newspapers on porch steps as if the world hadn't ended. The camp itself defied every expectation. There were wooden barracks, yes, and fences topped with wire. But the barracks had glass windows and proper floors. Each woman had her own cot with a mattress, not straw, but an actual mattress with springs. There were flush toilets in buildings separate from where they slept. Hot water came from taps when you turned them. Elizabeth, a nurse from Hamburg, turned the hot water tap on and off 5 times that first night, unable to believe it would keep working. They had expected to be worked to death. That's what happened to enemies, especially women who had served the Reich in any capacity. Most of them had been auxiliaries, anti-aircraft spotters, communication operators, clerks and cooks and drivers. They had worn uniforms and taken oaths. They knew what their own side had done to captured Soviet women. They had seen the columns of starving prisoners heading east. Now they were the prisoners, and they waited for their own march to nowhere. Instead, there was breakfast. Real breakfast with eggs and bread and butter, and coffee that tasted like coffee. Not the ersatz mixture of acorns and chicory they'd been drinking for 3 years. Anna, barely 20, cried into her scrambled eggs that first morning. Not from sadness, but from the impossibility of it all. The eggs were fresh. She could taste the richness of the yolk, feel the warmth of the bread that had been baked that very morning. Her stomach, shrunken from months of turnip soup and sawdust bread, cramped at the richness. The American camp commander, Colonel Williams, addressed them through a translator on the second day. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes who spoke slowly, as if choosing each word carefully. The women would work, he explained, but they would be paid for their work according to the Geneva Convention. They would receive the same wages as American soldiers of equivalent rank who performed the same duties. The translator, a German-American woman from Milwaukee, repeated his words twice because the silence that followed suggested no one had understood. Greta remembered looking around the room at the other women's faces, searching for someone who could make sense of this. They were enemies. They were defeated. Their country lay in ruins, their cities bombed to dust, their leaders dead or captured. And yet this American colonel was talking about wages and rights and conventions as if they were human beings deserving of dignity. As if the war hadn't proven exactly what humans would do to each other given the chance. The work assignments came on the 3rd day. Kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning, gardening, clerical work for those who spoke English. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, Sundays off. The very concept of a day off made some of the women laugh bitter, confused laughter that had no joy in it. When had they last had a day off? When had work been something with boundaries, with beginnings and endings, rather than a constant state of existence? It was not the work that unsettled them, but the conditions of the work. In the kitchen where Greta peeled her potatoes, there was a radio playing American music. The guards didn't shout or strike them for working too slowly. When Margaret burned a pot of soup, the American cook showed her how to salvage it instead of beating her. When Elizabeth made an error in the medical inventory, the doctor explained the correct procedure instead of reporting her for sabotage. Each small kindness felt like a debt they could never repay, a weight that grew heavier with accumulation. The pay came at the end of the first month, 80 cents a day, the standard rate for prisoner labor under military guidelines. To the Americans, it was almost nothing less than they'd pay a local teenager to sweep floors. But to women who had watched their money become worthless, who had carried wheelbarrows full of Reichsmarks to buy a single loaf of bread during the inflation, who had been paid in ration cards and promises for the last 2 years of the war, it was impossible wealth. More than impossible, it was incomprehensible. Ursula did the mathematics over and over on a scrap of paper. 80 cents a day times 24 working days, $19.20. She converted it to Reichsmarks at the official exchange rate, then stopped because the number made no sense. It was more than her husband had earned in his best month as a factory foreman, and he was dead now, buried somewhere in Russia, while she, a prisoner, counted American dollars in an enemy camp. They were allowed to spend the money at the camp store. This too felt like a fever dream or an elaborate psychological torture. The store had chocolate, real chocolate, not the gritty substitute made from turnips they'd been given for Christmas in 1944. It had soap that smelled like flowers, toothpaste that actually cleaned your teeth, shampoo in bottles, not the homemade mixture of egg and vinegar they'd been using. It had cigarettes and coffee and sugar, white sugar that poured like snow from the bag. Anna bought a lipstick. She hadn't owned lipstick since 1942, and even then it had been a precious thing, saved for special occasions that stopped coming as the war ground on. This lipstick cost 50 cents, more than half a day's wages, and she stood in the barracks that night looking at it, unable to put it on. It felt like betrayal. Her brother was dead in Africa. Her father was missing on the Eastern Front. Hamburg was rubble. And she had American lipstick that cost more than a German worker earned in a day. The older women tried to save their money, hiding it in their mattresses or sewing it into the hems of their uniforms. They had lived through one complete economic collapse and expected another. Money was just paper, they knew. It could become worthless overnight. But the younger ones slowly began to spend, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. They bought writing paper and stamps to send letters home. They bought playing cards and books in English, determined to learn the language of this strange new world they'd fallen into. It was not the money itself that broke their understanding, but what the money represented. They were valuable enough to pay. Their labor had worth that could be measured and compensated. After years of being told they were inferior, that their enemies were inhuman monsters who would show no mercy, here was mercy so casual it came in a pay envelope every month. Here was dignity so routine it was written into regulations and followed without question. Some of them began to work harder, not from fear but from something more complex. Pride, perhaps, or shame at being treated better as prisoners than they'd treated others, or simple human need to be worthy of the incomprehensible kindness they were receiving. Greta found herself taking extra care with the potatoes, cutting away every imperfection, making each one as perfect as she could. Not because anyone demanded it, but because the Americans were paying her as if her work mattered, and she wanted it to matter. The guards noticed the change. These German women, who had arrived sullen and terrified, began to take ownership of their tasks. The kitchen ran more efficiently. The laundry came back cleaner. The gardens produced more vegetables. It wasn't collaboration. That word carried too much weight, too much history. It was something quieter, more personal. It was people discovering they still had the capacity to take pride in small things. Letters from home, when they finally arrived, made everything more complicated. Greta's mother wrote about standing in line for 6 hours for a loaf of bread, about burning furniture to stay warm, about the occupation zones and the uncertainty and the hunger that made children's bellies swell. And here was Greta with $19.20, able to buy chocolate whenever she wanted. The guilt was a physical thing, a stone in her chest that made breathing difficult. Some of the women tried to send money home, but the logistics were nearly impossible. The occupation authorities had different currencies in different zones. The Reichsmark was essentially worthless. The Americans suggested they could send packages instead: food, soap, clothes bought from the camp store or through mail-order catalogs they were allowed to browse. The idea that they, prisoners, could send aid to their families in Germany was so absurd that Margaret laughed until she cried, then cried until she couldn't breathe. As autumn turned to winter, routines settled into place. The women woke at 6, ate breakfast at 6:30, worked from 7 to 5 with an hour for lunch. They were paid on the last Friday of each month. They could attend English classes in the evening, led by a volunteer from the nearby town who treated them like students, not enemies. They could write 2 letters a week. They could request specific items for the camp store, and often those items would appear within a month. It was not the life they had expected as prisoners. It was better than the life they'd left behind in the ruins of Germany. This reversal, this impossible inversion of fortune, created a kind of vertigo that never quite went away. Elizabeth wrote in a letter to her sister, "I keep waiting to wake up. I keep waiting for them to remember we are enemies. But every morning there is breakfast and work, and in the evening there is dinner, and sometimes even a film to watch. I am paid for my labor. I sleep in a bed. I am clean and fed and safe. I don't understand this world anymore." The American women who worked alongside them as civilian employees were another source of confusion. These women earned more $1.50 an hour, but they talked to the German prisoners as if they were colleagues. They complained about the same things: the Louisiana heat, the mosquitoes, the monotony of certain tasks. They shared pictures of their children, stories of their husbands overseas. One secretary named Betty taught Ursula how to type on an American typewriter, patient with her mistakes, celebrating when she reached 20 words per minute. This ordinary kindness, repeated daily, was more destabilizing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they could understand. Cruelty fit the world they knew, the lessons they'd learned about enemies and war and the price of defeat. But Betty bringing homemade cookies to share, the camp doctor treating their ailments with the same care he'd give his own family, the guards saying please and thank you, this required a complete reimagining of the world. The Christmas of 1945 was when many of them finally broke. The camp organized a celebration. There was a tree in the mess hall, decorated with ornaments made by local churches. There was special food, turkey and stuffing and pies, real coffee and even wine. The women were given the day off, of course, but were paid for it anyway, holiday pay, the administrator explained, as if this were perfectly normal. Each woman received a package from the Red Cross with warm socks, chocolate, cigarettes, and soap. Anna sat on her bunk that Christmas night, holding her pay envelope for December $22.40 because of the holiday pay, and tried to remember the last Christmas before everything changed. 1938, maybe, when her father still had his shop and they could afford a goose for dinner. Now her father was gone, the shop was rubble, and she had more money than the family had seen in years. She was a defeated enemy in a prison camp, and she was richer than she'd been as a free citizen of the Reich. The women who had been nurses and medical assistants were eventually allowed to work in the camp hospital, treating other prisoners and even helping with American soldiers who came for minor treatments. They were paid the same rate, but the work gave them something money couldn't: a sense of purpose, of using their skills, of being useful in ways that transcended nationality or prisoner status. Elizabeth found herself treating an American soldier's infected wound with the same care she'd have given a German soldier, and he thanked her in broken German he'd learned somewhere in France. It was not the wages that transformed them, but what the wages meant. Every pay envelope was a message. You have worth. Your labor has value. You are more than your defeat, more than your past, more than the uniform you once wore. It was a message that contradicted every